Hi, everyone. How are you? Thank you for joining another mid month, well, late month, monthly check in for Calm in the Chaos. This month, we're focusing on loneliness. And that came from feedback that we received from the article that we were featured in for Mental Health Awareness Month with the Project Management Institute. I'm your host, Michele Badie. I'm a project management professional and a mental health advocate.
And I am your co host, Valerie Dorstonville, a licensed mental health therapist.
So, Val, what are your initial thoughts about loneliness in the workplace?
You know, I feel like it happens a lot more frequently than people can even really even recognize it for themselves. Like, I think it's easier for people to recognize it than maybe other people, but I don't think people find it easy to recognize it for themselves.
I think it shows up in different ways. I don't think it's linear for sake of conversation. I don't find it to be linear.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Do you, in 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 the time that you've been a project manager, was there a point in time where you first recognized that it could be experienced as part of your role?
I think it shows up in different ways. I think from my observation experience, it can come when you are championing championing a perspective that
Okay.
might not be embraced by the team,
Mm,
and you
okay.
can experience isolation, and you have to stay true to yourself in your role of being a strategic advisor and sometimes giving the unpopular opinion. And so sometimes when you're giving the unpopular opinion, that can be lonely, right? Someone might not
Mhm.
Team members might not want to talk to you. They might feel that you're not communicating in a way that's favorable to their perspective. And your commitment as a project management professional is to the sponsor and to making sure that the scope is completed and shining light on areas that could potentially be risk and making sure that everyone has a voice at the table. And sometimes that can be lonely, being
Yeah.
that person.
So essentially, the problem gets the message gets blamed on the messenger, so to speak.
Sometimes, and then sometimes I think it's just also right for me to mention when you are in those type of situations, sometimes not those situations, but sometimes it could be where you are your own blocker to being lonely. You might not be
Mhm.
approachable in your communication. You might be someone that's difficult to communicate with. Sometimes, if you're not respectful of others' times, be it starting meetings on time, or sending out information as expected, or asking for things late and not giving people, enough time to get things done, that can also isolate you and make you feel lonely. So I just think that accountability and
Mhm.
understanding your role are things that you have to be mindful of when assessing how you got to a state possibly of being lonely or feeling
Mhm.
lonely.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's not something that's continual, but it could be depending upon circumstances, but you just never know. I just think it's something you have to be mindful of. So, Val, in defining loneliness, what's the difference between loneliness and simply being alone at work?
I feel like simply being alone at work is basically a physical description, where I feel like loneliness is a a really subjective perspective, right? We've all had moments where we could be surrounded by people, but subjectively still feel lonely.
Mm.
And then in other spaces where you could feel where you're maybe physically alone in a space, such as maybe a person who works remotely, right, or offsite from their team, and they don't feel lonely in the in their perception of their team dynamics. So I think really kind of tailoring the difference between the very subjective description of how a person feels lonely versus whether they're physically and actually alone in a space, right? Um, for I know that in throughout the course of your own experiences, do you feel that loneliness is kind of maybe occurs more frequently in a particular type of setting, whether that's remote or hybrid or completely in place, or do you feel like there are differences amongst your own experience and feeling lonely across those environments?
I have worked remotely, hybrid, and on site.
Mm,
And I find that working remotely, I don't feel lonely. I feel like I'm more connected sometimes to the
mm,
team just based on intentionality of effort to be connected. Because working with fellow project managers, you the team wants to feel close. They need to be close. They need to communicate. So there's a lot more intentionality when navigating conflict, you know, navigating to conflict resolution. There's not a
mm.
lot more, I've experienced a lot more intentionality just getting to know each other. I find managers are very intentional to curate a connected environment, be it an unofficial happy hour. Of course, it's mocktail, bring your own mocktail, whatever. Games, having a game night, game afternoon. Um, you know, two things. One, it was a two truths and a lie. Like,
Live. Mm.
just different ways to get to know the team and just connecting with people, making sure people are tuning in to people. There's just different aspects of that.
I love the fact that you said the level of intentionality behind the effort that goes in from an organization wanting to create and curate connectiveness amongst its employees, right? I think in spaces where people, work in close quarters and are, in a particular space together, I think there's a level of like certain level of expectation, or that connection is going to be somewhat are automatically a given because people are working in very close proximity to each other, and that seems to be the expectation or how the team moves because we're close together. So that means it makes it easier for people to build close relationships. But it sounds like even in spaces, regardless of whether you're in close proximity or, across time zones or multiple time zones, or continents, it still boils down to a certain level of intentionality behind really fostering connection to really mitigate any sense of loneliness that team members might feel. So I really appreciate you utilizing that word in particular and sharing that experience. I think over time, more and more people have gone remote, especially on the heels of during the pandemic and subsequently after. So I think that's really a great point that you made. Um,
I do want to add, like my experience from working in a hybrid environment is that, you know, there is a lot of effort that companies have put into making the on-site a collaborative, like after coming out of the pandemic, like you were saying, like making sure that it was a collaborative environment, making investments in specific technology, making investments in more team events and workshops to bring the employees together. But what I found to be interesting when working in a hybrid environment is that some people, and I would not just say from my experience exclusively, but also talking to other project managers that have worked in a hybrid environment, was the experience that sometimes that everyone would come on the set days they were supposed to come in. They,
mm,
they would come in they have their own rules of engagement for sake of
Mhm.
competition, which ends up sometimes breeding resentment because someone could be there, but their peer's not there when they're supposed to have this collaboration, right? So,
Mhm.
and then that makes you feel lonely because that person potentially could be feeling like alone and lonely because they're following the rules, doing what's asked of them, but yet not everyone is, finding value and the effort and the request to be a part of a collaborative because you're hybrid, right? So I
Mhm.
think there's that. And then I think sometimes, which can affect, plays an effect some in all aspects, but I think when you're on site, it can really hit is office politics, right? Um,
Mhm.
it can show up differently. There's power in being in the office. There's no doubt about it. And sometimes there's a perspective that many stand for, firm on is that you're going to be promoted more. So if you are in the office, and if that's what you're looking for, promotion, right? If you're looking for accelerating your career, that can happen primarily by being on site. And I've witnessed some people that they have gotten creative, right? And how to make that happen, to make their voices heard and things of that nature, and like networking with people. And what does that look like? So for some people, I think it can be creative, but I think there's multiple factors that need to be considered when addressing the pros and lessons of engagement when it comes to hybrid, on-site, or remote.
Mhm. I mean, it sounds like that visibility piece is key in terms of whether that is to build a certain level of connection, whether that is to position oneself for um, visibility with leaders, whether that's for creating opportunity for increased visibility with colleagues or people within your same team. That visibility piece seems to be an important aspect of m- managing and mitigating any feelings of loneliness that people may experience.
So, with you saying that, Val, what are some things that project management professionals can be particularly vulnerable to when it comes to loneliness and navigating emotional isolation?
Well, for one, I mean, the role of a project manager often is kind of this connector, right? In terms of really serving as this liaison between multiple multiple roles across multiple kind of levels within the organization. And I think at times that often leaves in the sense of like they don't necessarily have this level of an ally per se, or like a person who's actually in the trenches with them, because within their project they're likely the only project manager working on that particular project, and so the other project managers are doing other things. So even though they may be on this particular team, that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody on that team has the same role as them. So that automatically tends to breed a certain level of isolation, because I've heard project managers tell me that nobody they don't have that level of somebody who gets them, or somebody that they can effectively consistently relate to, because the other project managers that are within that organization aren't directly working with them. And so I think that that is one very key point in which it's easy for project managers to experience a level of loneliness. But also, just to bring up the point that you said earlier, the having to share maybe information or communicate information that others may not necessarily want to hear, even if it is something that they need to hear. And I think that can create some distance and some resistance from other team members wanting to maybe get closer to the project manager, or really kind of creating that connection, because ultimately they're really having to kind of coordinate amongst people and really manage like shifting responsibilities or timelines or deadlines that are being changed and deliverables that may be getting changed, and really it really reduces the opportunity for that certain level of visibility with people who are in a similar role that they are in, right? And so I feel like when you think about how that loneliness kind of impacts a particular individual, how do you feel like that impacts that project manager's ability for leadership, right? Or being able to kind of be the person who is motivating this team if they are someone in the throes of feeling lonely within their space.
I think it just initially comes down to just calling a thing and taking that time to self assess because
Mhm.
someone could almost label loneliness as burnout.
Hmm. Yeah.
It can almost be labeled as burnout. It's still, it seems to me, you being the licensed therapist can tell me if I'm right, but it just seems to me there's a lot of similar, if you check the box, there's a lot of similarities between that, right? That could be
Absolutely.
and you're like, oh, I think I'm just burnt out, but you're actually dealing with loneliness. You need to figure out how to connect with people. And let me be clear, loneliness, I'm referring when during this conversation, I'm speaking of loneliness in the workplace. I'm not saying loneliness like from personal life. I'm speaking of loneliness with colleagues or not potentially being understood. But then that also comes down to, are you communicating well? Are you communicating? How are you communicating? What is your messaging? Is it clear? Like oftentimes I think that's a skill us project management professionals are always working on. How are we communicating? What is the definition? Like I think we study words a lot, right? What does that mean? Like, what are you saying? What is the takeaway? I think we're asking a lot of clarifying questions on a regular basis just to make sure we're understanding what it is. Because you can say one term in one with one team, you can use the same word with another team and they interpret it completely different.
Absolutely.
So I
Absolutely.
just think that sometimes, again, like, earlier, you have to, you know, maybe it's not your attitude, right? Maybe it's not you're not being presenting as an approachable person, but maybe you're not being flexible in your communication, right? It's almost like do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You want people to understand you. So we as project managers have to lead with understanding others. We are the ones that are constantly accommodating the pet peeves and the isms and the requests and the specifics of a task. And I think that is something that's often, sometimes unintentionally, right, forgotten about working with the project manager is that we are innately flexible. And
Mhm.
we also need that given to us. We need grace extended to us. We need flexibility extended to us. We need someone to understand what we're saying. And oftentimes, if you work with people that understand you and you work together sometime where they just, an overall top tier professional,
Mhm.
people are going to make that accommodation organically and naturally. And sometimes people working with other people can be a very pickling experience. And
Mhm.
those reminders might need to be, given. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just life. And I feel like it's a time where you can just grow in the communication styles. Just a thought.
Yeah. That definitely reminds me of um Stephen Covey's book, in which the one of the highly effective skills, the seven highly effective skills, is to listen, to understand, right, and not necessarily to respond. And I think that so many of us really, whether we recognize it or not, actually do struggle with active listening. Right?
Mhm.
And when you're listening to a person articulate themselves, it's not in this time to hear a piece of that conversation. And while that person is still talking, you're crafting and drafting your response in your head as you're waiting for them to stop talking, right? And you're kind of like, oh, okay, like where they paused, okay, let me jump in and give my response. So I think that I think that's a great point in terms of really trying to reciprocate the same level of understanding and grace being extended across the teams. And then I also think you had earlier mentioned the differences between, or the similarities rather, between loneliness and signs of burnout, right? And I do think there are some things that do look alike, a certain level of disengagement, reluctance to participate in collaborative conversations or meetings or outings and get-togethers. Those can absolutely look and present themselves in both experiences, the experience of burnout as well as the experience of loneliness. But I think that the difference here, as it relates to burnout maybe versus loneliness, is that with burnout, it begins to seep into other spaces of your functioning. So
Mhm.
you're not going to solely be burnt out at work and then go on your merry way and bebop through the rest of your life, right?
Mhm.
Um, Usually, if you see this more widespread presentation in terms of disengagement in professional spaces, as well as disengagement and isolation within personal spaces, it's more indicative of burnout versus loneliness, which is a subjective experience, can occur at work and you not necessarily feel lonely outside of work. And so that tends for me to be one of the signs. If you're noticing that there is a more widespread consistency in how you show up in both sides of your life, both personal and professional, it's likely more burnout. If you notice that it's specifically happening towards work, it's more likely to be loneliness.
Oh, I appreciate that breakdown, that cross reference. I feel like that should be a worksheet of comparison, like a feelings wheel.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Because
like a feelings wheel.
there's so many different um, elements, right, that we bring into our workday. Right?
Yeah.
We spend way more time at work than we do anywhere else. I mean, we spend more time oftentimes working than we do sleeping.
Mhm.
So, in a lot of ways, I do find that there has to be, to your our initial point, the level of intentionality behind the way that you move. And if you are noticing that you are shying away from a certain level of visibility and connection with, whether that be with your peers or even with leadership, then there should be some level of some self-assessment and checking in with yourself to determine, okay, what's going on here, especially if that wasn't how you originally were showing up, right? If that was kind of like your baseline and you've been, more introverted as an example, and that's how you move through life all the time, well, that's a little bit different. But if you are more engaged and then over time you're finding yourself becoming more and more distant, that's definitely something to pay attention to as well.
So mm, how does long-term loneliness impact focus and decision making and like just basic emotional regulation?
Hmm. I think in a couple different ways. One of the things that a lot of my patients often talk to me about is this concept of imposter syndrome, right? And the best way to really combat imposter syndrome is a cognitive tactic called reality testing. And essentially, what that means is you are going to look at all of the ways in your current reality that either supports or challenges this belief structure, right?
Mm.
So, for a person who is lonely, if you are experiencing imposter syndrome, well, it's much harder for you to get the feedback, the input, and the support from your peers who are going to, be making, providing you with feedback and positive reinforcement in order to create that challenge of that thought process, right? And so it's going to be much easier to believe this, to really kind of believe in this belief and this narrative that I'm not good enough and that, I'm not connected enough. And that then perpetuates the same, the behavioral response that kind of coincides. So it becomes somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy, ultimately, in which you are not seeking, additional feedback and input. It continues to make you feel worse, and then the worse that you feel, you kind of reinforce. You see, nobody's talking to me, but you're also not making yourself available and visible for people to engage with you. So it
Mm.
kind of becomes a complicated little loop that you can create. Another thing that you can notice is that oftentimes people try to then overcompensate in other ways. So if they are feeling disconnected in one area, then their pendulum may swing a little bit more heavier in a different area and trying to kind of make up for it, so to speak. And I think that that is something else that you can also recognize in teams. And then I don't know. I think the other thing also is can really be this other piece of just people pleasing, and because you may be feeling lonely in certain spaces, then you may be less likely to share information that you may further alienate you, right? So
Mm.
sharing a message or having a difference of opinion that is maybe um, contradictory to the rest of the team, you may be less likely to speak up in that manner for fear that there will be some level of negative repercussions where people will be more apt to stay away from you. So it can show up in a couple different ways, I think, in that manner. Um, but I wonder in if you're thinking about maybe in a project manager really kind of experiencing that level of loneliness, is there a way that you have seen within either your own experience or maybe things that you've observed in others, and where people are able to stay more grounded and supported while they're still kind of managing the maybe some of the pressures and deliverables across different lines to really kind of maybe combat some of that loneliness that they may feel and due to being the messenger.
Yeah, thank you. I would say that comes from open communication
Mm,
when project management professionals are within your team or across or up, just being having these conversations to be open to what others are saying. And usually what those conversations lead to is past experience, lessons learned.
mm,
You find out that you might not be the only person experiencing that experience, or this could be a duplicative
mhm.
experience based off of someone else's effort, and you might be going about it the same way, or they might say, course correct, pivot, try it this way, whatever the case may be. And I
Yeah.
just think communication it's such it can be a gift, right?
Mhm,
If executed well, respectfully, kindly, and you're open to something other than your own perspective, and really, to your point earlier, active listening, right? Being an active listener to what people could be saying, I think is super key to navigating that, because you realize it's not exclusive. Some experiences are
mhm.
not exclusive to you. Some personalities are not exclusively difficult with you. Some personalities you got a tag team to navigate, and you
Absolutely.
might get a partner to say, you know what, I'm going to join that call with you. We're going to come, get on this together and see what happens if we show up as a united front. So I just think communication is key, and being willing to sit at a table and just open up a little bit, despite your feeling. And the beauty of that is you're getting to know your peers and those that you work with, right? So they're going to be able to read you just like you read them. So now you're
Mhm.
going to have another pair of eyes on you. If they're sincerely connected and you have that synergy, they're going to be like, hey, are you okay? Like, what's going on? We are constant pulse checkers, project management professionals. We're constant pulse checkers. So someone might return that pulse check back by you being willing
I love
to have
that.
communication.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And I love the idea of tag teaming, right? Because
Yeah.
no matter where you go, there are going to be challenging personalities, right? And so I think recognizing that you don't have to necessarily do it all on your own in
Mm-mm.
order to respond to that really does provide a great opportunity to build greater connection and really reduce that sense of loneliness you may feel. by acknowledging that you may not be the only person who's having this particular experience. So I love that, really.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Do you have any final thoughts, any shares, any takeaways, any aha moments?
I think from the concept of one, loneliness can occur at any point in time in your professional and experience. It's not necessarily solely a phenomenon that occurs when you're like the new person on the team, right? I think people expect that to be the case when you don't really know anyone yet, but loneliness can occur at any point in time throughout the continuum of your professional experience. And so I think recognizing that if you are experiencing loneliness, that it isn't necessarily a sign that you are either, it, that it's something that's always directly external. I think being mindful of checking in with yourself and identify, are you doing things either consciously or unconsciously that is leading to the sense of loneliness? Are you actively pulling away? Have you done, is there anything that you can identify from your end that has changed in the way that you approach your team that may be sending the signal to kind of essentially stay away from me? And if that has come from because of a grief or a loss from, because we talked about grief in our past episodes, in terms of a loss that comes from maybe a change in policy, a change in procedures, a change of staff, a change in leadership that ultimately pushes people out. I think that's important to recognize and call out any periods of time when you are feeling either that sense of loss, and then that subsequently maybe triggers a sense of loneliness in that space. So checking in with yourself and seeing what else you can do. I mean, and if you are in a space where you want to be alone, then be intentional about it, right? Utilize that time to actively to fill your cup the way that you need. Solitude in and of itself is absolutely not a bad thing. It can be a great time to kind of decompress, recharge, do things that you need to do for yourself to be more grounded and ready. But I think it's really important to first check in with yourself and utilize that time very intentionally moving forward. How about you?
I would say loneliness. Well, thank you for those awesome shares. And I would say loneliness can come in seasons like anything else. And
Mm,
recognizing that it can be temporary, it doesn't have to be long term. And I appreciate you reiterating that, we as project managed professionals, from being self-aware, asking for help, right? Asking for someone, do you see what I see? Is it me? Can help us, help us not stay in that space. I think it's sometimes very organic, and then sometimes I think it's self-inflicting. But however you end up in that space, it's important that you work yourself out of it, because project managers are so talented, like many other professionals, right? And so gifted.
totally.
And we have to make sure that we keep ourselves well, right? We stay well in order to interact in a healthy manner, because we impact how people show up. I often say
Absolutely.
the temperament of the project. So it's key, that we continue, like many are doing, to be aware of what that looks like, how we're contributing in that manner.
Yeah, I love that. That was great. Love that point.
Well, we appreciate you joining another month of Calm in the Chaos, another,
Absolutely.
yeah, another mental health wellness check-in. Thanks for joining us, and we appreciate the feedback. The feedback is what got the selected topic for this month of loneliness. So thank y'all for listening, for watching the replay, for joining us, for cheering us on with this platform of just encouraging wellness in the workplace. We appreciate you, and we look forward to chatting with you next month.
Bye, everyone.